A programming note. The following podcast contains discussions of sexual violence. It may not be suitable for all audiences. For decades, conventional wisdom and common sense have told us that health issues like depression, anxiety, and PTSD can be long-term effects of psychological and physical trauma. But did you know that science is now exploring how many chronic diseases like diabetes, heart disease, cancer, obesity, and autoimmune disorders can be long-term effects of trauma, including traumas like sexual assault and participating in combat? In this episode, we're going to talk about what trauma, especially trauma in childhood, can do to the body in the long term. And it all starts with that powerful brain-gut connection. Before we get started, you may want to take the ACEs quiz. It's a short 10-question quiz developed by Kaiser Permanente and the CDC. It tallies different types of abuse and neglect that can happen in even the most average childhoods. The higher your score, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study found, the more likely you are to suffer from long-term health effects. Just do a Google search for ACEs quiz, and you'll find many options to take the quiz for free. And don't worry, the quiz is just a guide. It's not a death sentence. The good news is, we will also talk about what you can do to build resiliency and healing in your own life. Please join us. I'm Joelle Castex. I'm the Chief Content Officer at SpotTheLine. I'm an author, a speaker, and I've spent the past 20 years fighting for survivors of child sexual assault and institutional cover-up. Survivors like me, but who never had a voice. I'm here today with my co-host, Lauren Roselle, and she's a sexual harassment and assault prevention expert with 30 years of experience offering trainings in self-defense and sexual harassment prevention to teens and adults. She also happens to be one of the co-founders of SpotTheLine. Hey, Lauren.
Hello, Joelle.
I'm so glad we're doing this. So today we're going to talk about trauma and the body. And, I want to say first up, if you're anyone who's looking to do more reading on this, the Bible of the issue is a book called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And I believe that it should be required reading for every survivor of trauma who's struggling with any kind of issue having to do with their body. And we'll be talking a lot about what's discussed in the book and then other scientific advances and breakthroughs that have been made on the effects of trauma on the body. But for part one, let's talk about our initial reaction to trauma. Fight, flight, or freeze. How stress hormones from trauma can affect survivors far after the trauma is over. So we're going to talk about what trauma does to a survivor's brain and body and how many times the effects can last for years after the incident actually occurs. And this is a relatively new field of study. Attitudes have changed dramatically about this brain-body connection. And for example, if we look at shell shock or battle fatigue, that's what we used to call it. Back during World War I, World War II, and even all the way up to Vietnam. Mm-hmm. Men coming back from war or in the middle of fighting were told that having shell shock was a moral failing. And there's a really famous story about Patton getting upset with a soldier who was suffering from shell shock and called him a coward.
Oh, I've never heard that.
It's even in the movie Patton with George C. Scott, I believe.
Oh, okay.
But now, and whole generations of men stuffed their feelings away and suffered in shame and silence, but then there were consequences coming back. So for victims of sexual trauma, it's the same reaction, but it's only recently through things like the ACEs study and other studies on the long-term effects of trauma that we begin to understand what injuries these traumas can cause throughout our bodies. Every organ and system can be affected. The brain, the gut, the immune system, the endocrine system, our sexuality, our body image, our ability to feel and connect. And, it sounds totally hopeless, but fortunately, It's not. And at the end of this episode, we'll talk about tools to help us take back our bodies. But let's start at the beginning. Lauren, let's talk a little bit about how the body initially reacts to trauma. Explain fight, fight, or flee or freeze.
I know that's hard to say, right? Fight, flight, freeze.
Yeah.
So a lot of times you don't even hear about the freeze part. You just hear fight or flight, right? And when I'm teaching my self-defense classes, we're talking about, how to deal with a traumatic event in the moment. Someone's actually, threatening you with violence, and are you going to fight, or are you going to run, or what? But oftentimes you will freeze. That is a very common reaction. But what's happening in any event is it's about your amygdala, right? It's this part of your brain that kind of contributes to your emotional processing, sends a message to your hypothalamus. I mean, we can get very detailed about that, but it's sort of this is the command center that's communicating with the rest of your body about what to do with the energy, and whether you should fight or you should flee. And so it's a very kind of primal thing. But when we think about it in terms of trauma, what we don't always think about is not just that immediate event of what we do. Do we fight? Do we run? Do we have that frozen moment, or minutes? But what about what happens afterwards? And how do we keep fighting or fleeing or freezing, right? And I think that's where we want to focus a little bit today.
Well, and I learned something really very, very recently, that if you are able to escape a traumatic situation, your body
Yes.
stops secreting those stress hormones. So when we look at people who, like in my own case, I'm a victim of child sexual abuse, people who are victims of other kinds of long-term sexual assaults, they are never able to flee. So their body continually secretes these stress hormones, because you never get that escape. So your body's confused. And I thought that was fascinating, because I mean, I'll be perfectly frank, I live my whole life in that flight or freeze mode,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and so it's fascinating, because it does have long-term health
Are
effects.
you talking about that research that they did on the children in 9/11?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, elaborate on that. I think the listeners would love that.
So it's a great study, and it talked about a group of preschool children who were able to escape during 9/11. And when the Twin Towers fell, they were able to get across the Brooklyn Bridge. They had full understanding and recognition of what happened to them, and that these, they, and many of them even saw the traumatic things like the bodies falling from the buildings.
Mm-hmm.
But because they were able to escape, and their little minds were able to process that something like that was probably never going to happen again, they didn't have long-term effects of trauma that you would see in someone who was stressed. So their body stopped secreting those stress hormones.
So no PTSD.
Correct. No PTSD. And so I thought that was fascinating, because they still, they still have after effects, but they're not, suffering for years and years and years from the nightmares and everything else with the PTSD that survivors of other traumatic events suffer. And I that was fascinating. And so then when they looked at survivors and the stress hormones and long term, I think it will be fascinating to see how the study continues and how these kids grow up, because now they're in their 20s, because time passes, and as they grow older, the more instances and more likelihood whether or not they do end up with the autoimmune disorders and stuff like that we see other trauma survivors having.
Right.
So,
well, and especially if we're talking about, this makes a lot of sense if we're talking about survivors of sexual abuse or any kind of sexual assault, they weren't able to flee, right?
Yeah.
So that's where it does get stuck. They had the frozen response, and I've talked to a lot of survivors who feel guilty for, oh, I didn't do anything. I just was so stuck. I felt stuck. I felt frozen. I couldn't move my limbs, and they think that that's some fault of theirs. And it's like, no. That is what you were doing to survive in that moment.
Yeah. Well, because no one, well, now we're doing it more and more, but no one teaches you or no one taught you how to react when things like this happened. And
Because we didn't
especially,
even talk about that things like this happened.
yeah, and especially when you look at cases of like child sexual abuse, which is I keep going back to.
Of course.
It's for the kid, they're groomed most times. And grooming, for our listeners who don't know, is a process that a predator uses to trick a kid into blurring sexual boundaries and thinking that child sexual abuse is okay. And so, the kid isn't equipped with the right kind of reaction, so they don't know what to do. They never know what to expect, and so they're gonna react with the freeze or and just
Yeah.
and hide and continue to secrete these stress hormones that will then affect them for the rest of their lives. So, oh, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, when we look at, I know we're going to talk a little bit later about the long-term effects, but I also wanted to just bring up some of the effects that of way we might have a freeze response now based on something from before. Could be things like someone who holds their breath a lot, or has a sense of dread, or is feeling a little frozen or numb, feeling stuck in some part of your body. Those are all connected to that freeze response. And for example, for fight, I'm sorry, yeah, for fight, that could be someone who has a lot of feelings of anger, feels knots in their stomach, um, talks about the metaphors they use are like bombs going off or volcanoes erupting, or their hands are clenched in a fist. Those are things that we would now associate with, well, that's that fight response that's still kind of stuck in them. And then the flight is like, restless legs, or what's some other ones? Anxiety, right? Shallow breathing, being fidgety, sense of running in life, like one activity to the next. I know people who are excessive exercisers, and sometimes that can be an unhealthy thing because it's just the fight. It's just the flight, right? Manifesting in a more healthy way, right?
Yeah.
But it's still there. So it's interesting how these connect over time.
Well, and that's really interesting, because when you talk about the flight, there are studies done about survivors of these traumas who have to live in constant chaos in order to feel alive, because it's the only way they can feel. And we even
Mm.
see that in like some journalists who continually travel and work in war zones, because people are like, well, how could you do that? Your life is always on the line. Well, they won't be able to say it, but it's the only way that they can actually feel like they're living, because they're always in that flight mode.
Yeah,
They that
the bar has been raised so high, and it has to stay
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
Yeah, that is fascinating, because and it's interesting to see too that as the victim of trauma grows older, how the manifestation of fight, fight, or flee, or fight, fight, or freeze, I cannot say that,
I know.
um, is manifests itself in ways that you would want to act if it were happened to you right now. So when you talked about the anger, we see that in many male survivors of trauma, acting out with anger and violence and things like that happens later on. The
Hmm.
the expression of destruction is outward, and I never thought of that as part of the flee response.
Hmm. Or it can be a part of the fight response,
Yeah,
right? Yeah,
or
yeah,
the yeah.
yeah. And same thing with having suicidal feelings. That's also a part of the fight response. Interestingly,
Really?
yeah, it's homicidal or suicidal feelings is kind of connected to that,
Oh
because
my
it's
gosh.
taking an action. It's doing something dramatic, and right. So yeah, it is fascinating. You mentioned at the beginning in the intro, you mentioned the ACEs study, and I would love to spend a little time talking about this for people who don't know what this is, because I want everybody to know about what this is.
Please do.
So the ACE quiz is something you could just literally, if you just put on Google, ACE quiz, you'll find a website that has it. But it's a tally of different types of abuse, neglect, and other kind of hallmarks of a rough childhood. And ACE stands for adverse childhood experiences. And the higher your score is likely to be, the higher your score is, the more likely you are to have later in life health problems, right? So, and it's not that you can't overcome, there can be people that had a lot of trauma in their childhood, and that doesn't mean that they are destined to have health problems, but there's just a more of a higher likelihood. And so they've kind of broken it down into, I mean, there's several questions, and we don't have to go through them, but it's like some of them have to do with whether there was some type of abuse, could have to do with neglect. There's other category of like household dysfunction, like, did you have an alcoholic parent? Was there a divorce? That kind of thing. Behaviors that you engaged in, drug use, that kind of thing. And then physical and mental health gets impacted too. So.
Isn't like food insecurity and monetary insecurity part of it as well? The
Yeah,
poverty. Yeah.
yeah, I think so. Yeah. I can't remember the exact question that has to do with that, but it's under the neglect category, I think.
Well, and
Yeah.
it's a fascinating study that was done by Dr. Folletti at Kaiser down in San Diego, because this all came to be because the Kaiser Foundation had all this data that they were able to collect from people who came in for their um, uh, annual exams and stuff from any of their doctors at any of these Kaiser facilities.
Mm-hmm.
And they asked them a simple set of questions. And the questions are the ones that we just talked about. And they were able to see that people who suffered from these adverse experiences were more likely to suffer from long-term health conditions later on. And those long-term chronic health conditions include diabetes, obesity, autoimmune disorders, heart disease,
Wow.
stroke, and things that are,
Serious things.
yes, that are somewhat preventable, but kind of not. And so in knowing that information, they were able to help these people, because you don't just treat the diabetes, you
Right.
don't just treat the heart disease, you have to treat the underlying cause. And so understanding that the adverse childhood experiences contribute to this allows us to go society wide and intervene before these adverse childhood experiences become
That's right.
disease, and help these kids throughout even like the justice system and the foster care system, and make sure they get the help they need so that these adverse childhood experiences do not become long-term effects.
Here, here. When I first took the ACEs quiz, it was just a couple of years ago, and this was the case for some other people. We were all sitting in a room together, a group of friends, and we decided to to do it. And the first time we did it, we had scores like, I think my score was like a 3 or a 4. I can't exactly remember, but we went back and took it again, and my score was higher because I was more honest about what some of those areas, what they looked like in my life. So it was interesting that even someone like myself, who was like willing to address and admit and look at what was my childhood like and what was the good and the bad and the ugly, I still was sort of downplaying some of the issues that were in my life. And then when we went back and did it again, several of us had higher scores because we were just more connected to what the reality was.
Well, we all want to minimize the horrible things that happen to us.
Right.
And we look at other people in our lives, we're like, well, gosh, what happened to them is nowhere near, mine is not half as bad as that.
Right.
And so and I think what is important to remember if you take the ACEs quiz is that the only person in the room is you. And the only trauma in the room is yours, and the only effects are those on you. And it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks about your trauma.
That's
It's
right.
your trauma.
That's
It's
right.
your story. And guys, the first time I took the ACEs, I had the same thing that you and your friends did. I minimized because it's like, I don't really want to say horrible things about my dad. I like my dad,
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, he didn't do horrible things, but he allowed some pretty nasty things to happen. And we're beyond that and everything else. But it's like, it's okay. And I'm not assigning blame to anyone by doing this, So, yeah, it's a fascinating study. If you live in California, you might be seeing PSAs, the public service announcements saying know your score, because there's a big statewide push for people to understand ACEs and to address what's going on. Because if we can, someone was bright enough, possibly the California Surgeon General or whatever, bright enough to be like, hey, if we help these people understand that it was their adverse childhood experiences doing it, then, or that contribute to these problems, and we can intervene and help them.
Yes, and you mentioned the California Surgeon General. We are the only state that has their own Surgeon General.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's her name is Nadine Burke Harris, and she's awesome. So she is the one that sort of spearheaded this, and I think it's going to make a difference in generations to come.
Oh, definitely. Well, and the ACEs study was born in California, so it makes sense that we would do a big push for it. So now we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about what happens, the long-term effects, chronic disease, undiagnosable pain, gut issues, all that stuff. So we will be right back.
All of us here at Spot the Line are dedicated to a world where everyone is safe from all forms of sexual violence, including harassment, assault, and child sexual abuse. We create apps and unique technology to help people spot the line to prevent sexual misconduct in all its forms. Our first two intervention and prevention tools, the Sexual Harassment Meter and the Predatory Grooming Meter, will be released later this year.
This is the Spot the Line podcast. Welcome back. We just had a really interesting discussion about the body's initial reaction to trauma. We talked about the ACEs study and that adverse childhood experiences can have long-term effects on the body. And so now let's talk about what some of those long-term effects are. They can be anything from autoimmune disease to body hatred to food issues, panic attacks. I mean, there are a lot of issues that happen. So, I mean, I really want to start with the role of the gut, because I came to this topic very personally. I was diagnosed with lupus recently. And I knew that autoimmune disorders were pretty prevalent within the survivors community. And I was like, I just don't understand why. And when I started having symptoms, I'm like, oh no, I really don't want to deal with this. And what I learned is that there's a very scientific reason that survivors of trauma end up with autoimmune disorders. And autoimmune disorders are disorders where your immune system attacks itself. And there are things like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis and Sjogren's disease. There are a couple more autoimmunes out there. And what I learned was that when you go through trauma that you can't escape, your body continually secretes stress hormones that go into your gut and kill the good flora. And that good flora is the home of your immune system. And because your immune system stops functioning properly over the long term, it starts attacking the good cells as opposed to the cells it's not supposed to.
And lay people didn't even know the word flora until not that long ago, right? We didn't know that was something we needed to even be thinking about.
I mean, all we knew is that, you got sick, you took an antibiotic. And that killed our flora too. But so I found it fascinating that, it's not all in my head. It wasn't like bad things happen to me, so bad things will continue to happen to me.
Right. And also this idea that a lot of those diseases the autoimmune diseases you were just talking about are more prevalent in women. And then that became like a negative gender thing. Like, oh, women have these hysterical, symptoms that aren't real. And then here we go. We now know why more women have that, because more women are survivors.
Yeah. And, and something else that a lot of women suffer from are body issues,
Mm-hmm.
especially if they survive sexual assault. And I have some great quotes that I got from a social worker, and she reached out to some female sexual assault survivors and said, "How do you feel about your body?" And we got some interesting responses, and I'd like to read a couple of
Oh,
them
please do. Please do.
because this goes to a lot of the other long-term effects. Here's one quote: "Sex is no problem. I can have sex. I'm like a robot. I just do what I'm supposed to do, but making love, connecting, I can never be in my body long enough or in a way that would allow that kind of intimacy. Sex can only happen if it's just mechanical, detached, and purely physical. It's not because it's safe, it's just familiar."
Mm.
I find that fascinating, because it goes to that connected to the body and and that how you feel and react to things in
Right.
highly emotional, intimate situations. And and here's a
And yeah, and if you've been in a situation where you were victimized and you felt like the only way you could survive that was to sort of detach, right? To kind of disconnect from what was happening in that moment, then that becomes the go-to.
yeah, and I hear it's enormously common with survivors.
Right.
And it's here's another one. I have tremendous body anxiety. I'm super hypersensitive to any sensation, twinge, discomfort, or slight change. I notice it right away and obsess about it. I constantly feel like something's wrong with me, deeply wrong, beyond repair, and everyone can see it. They think I'm gross, disgusting, ugly. I know in my head it's not real, but it doesn't change my reactions.
Mm.
Yeah. So it's it so we're seeing that we have physical changes to the body that happen, and then these psychological issues that continue, that actually contribute to it. Because if you feel that you're gross and disgusting, you're going to do things to your body to try to make it not gross and disgusting, like starve or binge or whatever that might be.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Wow, that's intense. Another one that I wanted to be sure and highlight today in this talk is the issue of vaginismus. And chances are, most of of our listeners have not heard that term before. But 5 to 17% of women actually suffer from it. And it's an involuntary tensing up of the vagina. So for some people, it's at the start of sex they have that happen, or inserting a tampon, or during a pelvic exam even, that can be an issue. And yeah, there are things that can be done to kind of work through that. But what's interesting is the research that's been done on this more recently is like in a certain percentage of women who have no physical reason to have this issue, they do have the childhood psychogenic trauma. Psychogenic meaning psychological rather than physical.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So that to me was like, wow, this is happening to a good percentage of women who again think there's something wrong with them, physically, when really it's a physical manifestation from a trauma. And we've not been, maybe it hasn't been looked at, or hasn't been, that connection hasn't been made, so there's no way to heal it.
Well, and your body is always seeking safety. And when you think about it, we're between the women who are totally disconnected, like the first quote I gave,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
disconnected from body, to that, those are two sides of the same coin. When you think,
Exactly. We're going to tighten up and nothing's getting in, and I'm protecting.
yeah, and I hear that's super common in cases of like incest,
Mm-hmm.
because with the vaginismus, because when you think about it, if you, I mean, to bring up the very well known example, the Duggar family, if
Mm-hmm.
you have a brother who's coming in at night and and violating you, and you live in fear that you never know if tonight's the night,
That's right. You're constant alert.
yeah, your body's going to find a way to react that you, I mean, and it's not conscious. It's just your body doing its best to protect you because when you think of it evolutionarily speaking, you know,
Right.
the survival of the fittest isn't the first person who gets away from the bear. It's the person who gets away from their brother. And what a horrible statement to make, but it's fascinating to show that, you know, our body is always working to reach like safety and homeostasis.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the ways that it does that might not be the actual best, but it's doing its rotten best to help. And I think that also goes to you know, when you look at undiagnosable pain and other chronic diseases, um, your body is seeking homeostasis and safety. So let's look at diabetes and food eating issues. And there is a very, it's gallows humor, but there's a saying within the advocacy community that you show me a grossly obese person and I'll show you a survivor of childhood trauma.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the reason for that is, especially sexual trauma, if I eat lots and lots of food, I will be ugly and no one will come after me.
Mm-hmm.
Or I
Or
will have,
layers and layers of protection.
yeah, I will have a physical barrier. It's a way to create vaginismus in a way.
Yeah.
And I will have this barrier and someone will not be able to penetrate that barrier and get to me. And that's interesting. I find that a lot of male survivors end up with bulimia.
Mm.
And the reason for that is, especially because when you think about the gender identity issues that come with being a male survivor of sexual trauma by another male, and you do not identify as gay or bisexual, it's repulsive to you, even though you allowed it to happen, quote unquote.
Right.
And so by purging, it's a way for you to have control of something. Is the food goes into your body and that's repulsive to you too, so you can control it and you can get it out of your body. And
Yeah,
it's
and we're not saying that every person who suffers from these diseases has had the exact experience of childhood sexual trauma, but it's just a high percentage.
correct. Again, like we said before, it's not a death sentence. It's not this, and this is not a blanket assumption either.
Right.
We're not speaking to the masses. We're speaking to the individuals who might be suffering from these things and wonder, am I crazy?
That's right.
Because when you think about it, I mean, when you see, you know, the after school special about bulimia, it talks about the girls who are worried about how they look. It doesn't talk about the boy who's a survivor of sexual trauma.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting too. We find that children who are victims of poverty and hunger in childhood, which is an adverse childhood experience that affects you, also deal with obesity issues later on, because in their lizard brain, which is, you know, it's kind of a way to talk about the part of your brain that is just automatic. It's
Right.
like, I will never be, it's Scarlett O'Hara, I will never be hungry again.
That's right.
Yeah. So
Yeah, it's telling them that regardless of the fact that there's food aplenty, that's definitely an issue. I adopted my wife and I adopted both of our sons from foster care, and we were told in the beginning, you know, they're going to have issues around food. They might be hoarding food in their room, even though, you know, they can have food whenever they wanted. Right? That's what happens. You're trying to survive.
well, and it's any time that food is denied from you, it becomes an issue.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I have had a lifetime of food issues, and they didn't really stem from the sexual trauma. They extended from other abusive traumas from my mom, who just
Mm.
said I was fat, you know,
Yeah.
and so it's one of those things that it's like it takes a lifetime of behavioral modification and self-love to change it, but it's, you know, it's not an easy switch. I mean, there are many reasons why we have an obesity crisis and a diabetes crisis in this country. And a lot of them we can change easily by what we eat. And a lot of them are not going to be easily changed because they're our body's adaptations to childhood trauma.
Yeah.
I want to talk too about how our systems react. And when I say systems, I mean like the criminal and civil justice systems react to the manifestations. So when we look at things like our jails and how they are overcrowded, they do studies on them and find that a vast majority of the people in these jails have suffered from childhood trauma.
That's right.
And because the system was not geared to handle it with trauma-informed care, they just said, oh, this kid's a repeat offender, so they're never going to get better. We're going to lock them away forever. These poor people with their chronic problems are locked up in a situation where they get zero help and zero chance of rehabilitation. And I just find that so tragically sad.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I haven't looked into this, but I wonder if there is just like a health crisis in our prisons.
Oh, I'm sure. And I'm sure we could do a podcast just on that. Maybe we could bring in a guest and talk about it.
Yeah.
That would be good. That'd be good.
Another thing I want to talk about are panic attacks. So, and I'll disclose this on his behalf because he's very open about it. My husband was basically abandoned by his mother when he was 12, and he was a military brat. And so they moved around a lot, and his big connection was to his mom. And, when you're a kid who has no roots, because military brats, I believe, there's a great book. It's called Military Brats, and it talks about what they go through. And it's a very unique experience of not being grounded and living in a very authoritarian structure. They have very unique needs and suffer from very unique traumas. And so when his mom bolted, he was devastated. And so the family was moving across country because his dad was supposed to go to the Pentagon, and he said, I can't, I have these two kids. And so they gave him duty at a base in Victorville, which is in California. So they're driving cross country, and my husband ends up with hepatitis and almost dies.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's so bad that he's at, I believe it's Fitzsimmons Army Medical Center in Colorado. And his dad says, we got to find this kid's mom and get her back here. And he hunts her down and finds her and gets her back. And she sees him, and he gets instantly better. Now, you can't fake hepatitis.
Right.
Right. This kid just wasn't being dramatic.
And that's a trauma for any child under any circumstance to have, a parent, exit in any, sudden way at that age, let alone with all the other elements that you were describing with the military, no roots kind of thing.
Yeah. And so as he got older, he found, weirdly, that anytime he traveled, he just kind of felt weird. And then it became when his parents end up getting back together, then they finally get divorced, 15, 20 years later. And of course, in the meantime, you're never allowed to talk about that time mom left, as all enlightened families of the 70s were. And so now he's almost 60 and has severe travel anxiety. Severe.
Yeah.
And people say, well, just give him a Xanax. And it's like, no, you don't understand. And it's funny. It wasn't until after I read The Body Keeps the Score that I stopped trying to think that we could just condition him to travel. Because I realized that his visceral response is so awful. When he says, when we are at XYZ place, that he thinks he's dying, his body is acting like it's about to die. He's not gonna die. But it's like, why am I re-traumatizing him? And what, we've had people say, well, Mike, it's all in your head. And we're like, well, yeah, it is. And that doesn't make it any less awful.
No.
Or
powerful.
Yeah. And so there these like all these reactions that your body can have to trauma that are real. And just by, and it was interesting because the day I said, we don't have to continue working through this if you don't want to, all of a sudden it didn't relieve it completely by any stretch, but it made it somewhat better, because the worry and anxiety about the worry and anxiety was causing worry and anxiety.
Yeah.
And it was becoming this big horrible
And I don't
thing.
want to disappoint my family. And,
Yeah.
now you're saying it's okay. We don't have to change this. And then, oh, I can breathe.
Yeah. And so when you think, if it can cause that in a almost 60-year-old man, what other havoc is it wreaking on our bodies?
Right.
And so I think that, we should all grant ourselves a little bit of grace, and instead of, minimizing what we went through, really, taking account and being like, it's okay. I'm going to grant myself a little bit of grace. It's like when I was diagnosed with lupus, it was, my first reaction was to beat myself up. And then it's like, no, you know what? Maybe I just take care of myself for a change. And I just grant myself a little bit of grace.
That's right.
Yeah.
And you brought up that book again, and I do recommend to our listeners that if they have these kinds of issues that we're talking about, that they definitely pick up that book or get the audio version or whatever.
Yeah, because it's important to note that you're not crazy. If your body's breaking down, it's okay to get help, not just for your body breaking down, but for the reason, for the underlying trauma. So we're going to take a break, and in our next section, we're going to talk about other things that we can do to help change that muscle memory and grant ourselves a little bit of grace. So we'll be right back.
This is the Spot the Line podcast.
Welcome back. We've covered some pretty heavy stuff here, and it might be very alarming to many people. It's like, well, yeah, I do have panic attacks. I do have issues with my body when it comes to food and sex, and I do have lupus. I do have diabetes. It's hopeless. Well, we're here to say it's not hopeless, and there are things that you can do to help, retrain your brain and that muscle memory that's so important that, again, this is not a death sentence. So, Lauren, you have a great story about retraining your brain and muscle memory.
Oh, yeah. I was telling you a story about one of my students. I've been teaching self-defense for 30 years now, so I have a lot of stories, but this one really stuck with me. I was early on. I was teaching techniques about how to defend against different kinds of assault, and one of the ones that we work on is kind of a life-threatening assault, which is a chokehold, if someone's actually strangling you, right? And so we were partnering up, students with students, and doing the practice. And the first time this woman had hands put on her throat by another student, she froze. And even though I had already taught them how to get out of it, I already demonstrated that, and this was their chance to practice it, she just couldn't move at all. And you could see this look of terror in her eyes. And, the person who's working with her, stopped, of course, and let go. And she was able to share with the group, she was able to verbalize that she didn't realize until that moment that was part of an assault that had happened to her many years ago, that the person who assaulted her, choked her. And her body held that memory, which is why she had that frozen moment in the class, even though it's a totally safe space and she's being empowered to learn techniques and all of that. That it was still, she was overwhelmed in that moment. And then the good part about that is that then we were able to step by step ease her back into it and get her practice having a different outcome, right? Like now her body's going to do something to get out of that. Now her body has a response that's going to take care of her and keep her safe. But she was really surprised that she did not have that conscious memory until that moment.
And what a gift that it happened at that moment. Because can you imagine if she was actually in the midst of something else when that happened.
Right.
It would be like doubly or triply traumatizing, and she would lose that ability and those skills even more to retrain.
That's right. Yes. I mean, that's why I'm such a proponent of actually doing physical trainings, because we do know what all is carried in the body. And that if we can shift those memories and create new ones that are more effective and empowering and take care of us, we can get rid of those other ones that are holding us back.
And that's interesting. I wonder, and we'll have to have a fantastic sex therapist who works within the Mormon community of all places, and because they have a lot of issues around sexuality and healthy sexuality and stuff like that. And I'd be really interested to learn about, so this woman was, grabbed around the neck. Well, what happens in other sexual traumas for like the woman whose quote I read where she said, I'm just like a robot during sex. How do it'd be fascinating, and we'll have to go into that deeper. How do you learn to fix that?
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, I think it's really it's a baby step kind of a thing, right? I worked with a therapist, Elaine Miller-Karras, who because we just guested on her podcast.
Oh yeah,
Resiliency Within, and she had a client who had been assaulted, had a history of assault, and was not wanted to learn to defend herself, wanted to learn boundary setting and to protect her body, but was not ready to be in a class with other people like that. That might move too fast for her. It might just be too much stimulation, too much overload. But she was willing to have a private with me in the therapy appointment. So Elaine brought me in to work with her client, just in the confines of her office, and I could go at her pace, and we did some of the same things that I do in a class full of people. But it was like, okay, are you ready for this? Let's practice this. Let's practice putting up your hands and saying no to somebody. No, stop. And that was a big deal, right? For her to be able to say that and mean it and feel it in her body, and then that's the baby step.
Yeah, and that's because. And I that's a way that she granted herself grace. And I always bring that up because I think it's when I think Elaine brought it up in the podcast that we recorded with her earlier this week. Grace is such a beautiful word, and you have to learn to grant yourself a little bit of it, because it's so easy when you are the victim of trauma to continue to punish yourself because of your inability to, escape and process. And so when you think about, because I'll tell you, people constantly, you should just meditate. And I'm like, oh my God, there is nothing more horrifying,
stress-inducing.
Oh, I know. It's like if you tell me to meditate, and I'd be like, just thinking about meditation makes me want to go hit somebody. Like, no, because when your brain is constantly going, when you're constantly thinking about X, Y, and Z and fear and I guess that's part of my fight flight reaction, sitting down and being mindful is a horrifying experience. No one wants to live in my brain.
That's not a baby step.
Yeah. So what I found has been helpful for me is breathing exercises. Because and I was goofing around on the internet, and I found this thing, 21-day breathing course, and it's just like,
oh, okay,
yeah, 4 minutes a day. And I'm like, dude, I can totally do 4 minutes a day, and all you have to think about is the breathing. You don't have to center yourself. Well, you do, but it's not like focus on one thought or where are you now, or with that stuff that makes me go, you want to know where I am now? I'm in hell right now. So I found that was super helpful. I stumbled on it, did a little bit of research, and found out it's one of the best things for people to do when they are long-term sufferers of childhood trauma. And I mean, that's a great baby step.
Yeah, that's a whole new level to the saying, just breathe.
Yeah. Because just breathe. Well, yeah, if I don't breathe, I'm gonna die. Are you kidding? Yeah. But if and so giving me something to do that is keeps my mind busy just on doing it is helpful in a healing way. Many people find help with yoga. And it doesn't mean you have to put yourself into lotus position and stand on your head. There are yoga positions you can do in a chair. There are yoga positions you can do laying on the ground. My favorite one is what's the corpse pose. Woo, I
Uh-huh.
can do that. I can do
Yeah.
that one plenty.
Yes, right. Well,
So
and yeah, it has to do with what works for you, right? There's no one answer. And just because your friends are saying, "No, this is the answer. You have to do this kind of yoga." No, actually there's lots of different kinds of yoga, and I prefer one where I'm moving from position to position rather than someone else who prefers, like, I want to be in a position for an extended period of time. Those are doing different things for different people.
So I want to talk about another term that we hear a lot, and I'm wondering, and I want to talk about it in the terms of your classes and what you see there, and then we could talk. And that is disassociation.
Hmm.
Now, it's do you get a lot of that in your classes? Do you see that in your training?
I do see it. Definitely people can be triggered by a conversation that we're having about a specific what if scenario, or it could be that, like I said, with the woman who got grabbed, had that chokehold moment, where, she just sort of disappeared there in that terror for a few minutes. Like, that is something that happens for people. And I think that acknowledging that it's not unusual to have those moments. Now, if you're having moments that are lasting a really long time and you're really completely checked out, yeah, you want to see someone to try to work through some of that, because you don't want to be not present in your life, right?
Yeah.
But it is a part of what people did to survive the initial trauma.
Well, and for those of you who don't know, disassociation is when you separate yourself from your mentally from your physical body. And a great way to describe it is when you're driving and you realize, oh my gosh, like 5 minutes have passed and I don't even remember what happened. And see, I was on autopilot. I find it happens to me when I'm in the shower. I'm like, wait, did I condition my hair? Oh gosh, I hope I conditioned my hair.
Right. No.
Well, imagine having that in situations where it's not appropriate, like sex, like tough conversations, like when someone has their hands around your neck. I've seen this a lot in working with survivors when they are talking about what happened to them, that you see them disassociate and that they are not with you.
Yeah, they're not telling the story as if it happened to them. They're like, it happened to someone else, and they're just telling this, sharing a picture.
Yeah, and they think that comes from the point that our bodies are, of course, always trying to keep us safe, and our minds are always trying to keep us safe. And so during the trauma, you focus on something else. So I'm watching The Handmaid's Tale, and
Oh, wow.
not a
Talk
light
about trauma.
show, not for the faint-hearted.
No.
But when the main character, June Osborne, is raped in earlier seasons as Offred, the handmaiden, she focused on the wallpaper on the ceiling.
Right.
And the blue. And I remember, in my own case, focusing on the cold floor of the wardrobe closet of the choir room.
Mm.
And remembering that. And it's weird that that's how I disassociated, but I learn and it's about learning to, especially for women, it's coming back and feeling connected with your body, and that's a tough one. I mean, Lauren, have you heard when people talk about you go to the therapist, you're scared. Where do you feel that in your body?
Oh, yes. That's a question. I hate that question. I have to tell you. And I know it's a great question, but I hate that question because I have such a hard time answering it.
Yeah.
Where do you feel that? I'm feeling angry. Where do you feel the anger? well, and I'm like sitting there and my feet are planted on the ground and I'm trying to like figure out, if I had to name a place in my body, where is that? What are you asking me? I don't get it, you know? And so that tells me, oh, there is a disconnect, right? That
Yeah.
that is really difficult for me to identify where I'm feeling things. And some other people can say, oh, I feel it right in my gut. Oh, you know, I feel it in the, you know, the bigger muscles in my body and my thighs or whatever. And that makes sense to them. And then I'm sitting there going, wow, I don't know if I can, I don't know if I can name that. Or then I'll kind of think, well, it's this, maybe I'm going to say my throat, because it does have to do with communicating what I'm feeling, like I'm like
Yeah.
almost trying to make something up.
Well, and that's interesting because I'm the same way. And so I've had to learn how to feel more connected because my body's slowly breaking itself down. Whereas my husband Mike is the exact opposite. He's hypersensitive. He's like that other quote that I read in the previous section. Man, that guy has a hangnail and thinks he's gonna die. And so it's funny because he's like, oh, I have this little pain here. Oh, it could be cancer. I'm like, dude, you don't have cancer. But for him, because his childhood trauma is associated with almost dying and pain and abandonment,
Right.
that's how, so he's hyper vigilant there.
My eldest son, when he was young, he got, unbeknownst to us, he got a huge splinter in his toe. And when I say I mean, it's significant. And we thought we had pulled it out, or actually we didn't pull it out. He broke it off. And so then he was running track. This was in elementary school, and he did the whole track day. And that day we came home, and now his like toe is like totally red and, you know, huge. And we're like, what's going on here? We took him to the doctor. They x-rayed him. He had a giant piece of wood in his toe.
Poor guy.
Like it was significant. We kept it for a really long time when they finally took it out, because they're like, that can't be a piece of wood. No, it can't be. They were like, and sure enough, they had to open up the toe to get it out, because it had worked its way all the way through up to the top. I mean, it was crazy. But my point is, he was detached from that pain because he had had so much trauma. We didn't, he didn't come to our family till he was 5.5 years old. And he had a, history of trauma, but he was able to, no, I don't feel pain. It's okay. It's not that bad. And it was horrible.
Yeah. Poor guy. Oh
I
my
know.
God.
I know. We kept it. We're like, oh my gosh, look at what you walked around with for all those days. And this was in you, really worked. I mean, it was something. I hadn't thought about that in a long time until you just said that.
So what kinds of work has he done to help with, being more aware and centered around his body?
I don't know. I wouldn't say that there's been a lot, but he, of course, we provided him with a lot of therapy as a young person. He's in his 20s now, but when he was a child, we were trying to get him to work through as much as he could. But everyone has their, limitations, and they also have their timing, right?
Yeah.
You can't force someone to address something before they're ready to address it. And I think that's true of adults as well. We all kind of may know that we have some issues, but we all have to decide for ourselves when it's becoming, is it hindering our relationships? Is it hindering our ability to just enjoy life? And then maybe we feel like, oh, now it's time. I want to look at this and not be afraid of what I might find, and be hopeful that there's something different on the other side, that it's not going to get worse, that it's going to get better.
Well, and you touched on something very interesting there, because I just finished this other podcast where this predator had abused these kids allegedly, and the kids didn't come forward until they were adults, and people are like, well, what took you so long? And people said that to me too. What took you so long? And you just hit it right there. I came forward when I was ready, and no sooner.
Mm-hmm.
Because I needed the time to come to reckonings on my own and to heal in many ways. Now, I'm not fully healed, obviously. I'm talking to you about things I'm still suffering from. But it's a growth process. And so I think that if we can tell everyone, it's like every day is going to be better than yesterday, as long as you have an understanding that you are in control and in power in your life, and you can do anything you set your mind to. And I know that sounds cliched.
It does, but it doesn't sound so coming out of your mouth, Joelle, I have to say.
Oh, well, thank you. But it's and when I say you can do anything you want to, it doesn't mean that you can, you don't have to scale Everest.
Right.
But, sometimes a big victory is making your bed. And it's okay to embrace that. Because if you embrace those little victories, those baby steps, the fact that, you do a breathing exercise or whatever, then tomorrow is going to be a little bit better. Because,
tomorrow you can do an extra minute of breathing.
Yeah. And just grant yourself that little bit of grace and accept, and this is a big one too. Sometimes your biggest victory of the day is to accept love that is handed to you. And when someone loves you, you accept it. And that's a huge victory too. So yeah, again, it's a big cliche, but it's just embracing every little thing that's positive as a victory that can really, I believe, help survivors make it through and move forward.
Yeah, well, and I hope today's segments have helped some people, and it may not be the listener who's dealing with this, but they may know someone in their family, and they're seeing some of this happening with them, and giving them a little bit better understanding about the depth of what trauma from long ago how it can stick with us, and giving that person a little grace too.
Well, and it's not healing at all to say just get over it. Because you don't understand that what this person is suffering isn't just being sad.
That's right. And I want to plug your book that is really for those people who are having someone disclose something to them. I don't remember the name of it.
Oh, it's the Compassionate Response. I give it away free on my website because, the big question that people have, someone comes forward and when someone comes forward to you, they do so because they see you as safe.
That's right.
And a safer option than anywhere else. Well, of course, nobody teaches you what to do or say when someone comes up to you and says, I was sexually abused as a child. And so you just end up looking at them and going, I'm sorry. Wow, that's deep. And so the book, The Compassionate Response, allows you time to read, and it's super short, and it gives you things to say to someone when they do come forward and disclose, because it's going to be at a bad time. It's going to be sometimes for the wrong reasons. It's going to be because they're in the hospital or in rehab or at a wedding, when they're triggered and that muscle memory comes in because they see the person who abused them, or they're surrounded by the people that they were surrounded by at the time the trauma was happening.
Right.
Always the first time.
So yes, you can always go to our SpotTheLine website to hear more about the kinds of work we're doing. But your book is actually on your personal website. And could you give that address?
Yes, that's castex.com, CASTEIX.com. So we're going to wrap this up. But if you want to learn more about this, the place that I recommend you start is a book called The Body Keeps the Score. And the author is Bessel van der Kolk, Kolk, MD. And it is easily one of the most enlightening, best books you can read on this subject.
Agreed. So if you like what we're doing here, give us a 5-star rating, because we're just starting out and we're hoping to get more subscribers. Subscribe now wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to share Spot the Line with your friends and family and colleagues. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at SpotTheLine. And of course, you can join our conversation on Facebook, because we want to be in conversation. We're all in this together. So until next time, all you fellow travelers, stay safe, be a good ally to others, and be ready and willing to spot the line. All of us here at Spot the Line are dedicated to a world where everyone is safe from all forms of sexual violence, including harassment, assault, and child sexual abuse. We create apps and unique technology to help people spot the line to prevent sexual misconduct in all its forms. Our first two intervention and prevention tools, the Sexual Harassment Meter and the Predatory Grooming Meter, will be released later this year.
If you like what we're doing here, give us a 5-star rating. Subscribe now wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to share Spot the Line with your friends, family, and colleagues. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at SpotTheLine, and join our conversation on Facebook because we're all in this together. Until next time, stay safe, be a good ally to others, never give up hope, and be ready and willing to spot the line. This is the Spot the Line podcast.